Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Recently, I was able to get an in-person group together featuring the people that I used to game with before I moved away from the Annapolis Valley, now that I'm living here once again. And one of our members is visiting during the summer from out of province. It was a great time to get an in-person game together, and the game that I wanted to run was Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The players were all interested in trying it out, and none of them, with the exception of one individual, had any previous experience with it, although the one person who did try it, it was long enough ago that he honestly didn't remember too much about the system. The players are a combination, the characters are a combination of pre-gen characters, with a few players that were able to actually make their own custom characters. I wanted to do a session 0, but I was the only one that owned any rule books, and when all you really have is one book, for everybody to use, it can really bog things down. So we went with the pre-gen or get together ahead of time to make characters options. And half the group ended up going with pre-gen characters. The other half were able to customize their characters. I am running Crown of the Kobold King, which I do plan on continuing even after my friend goes back to Alberta. The players that are left behind, we will just continue this as a once a month session, as opposed to the currently planned weekly sessions until our friend has to go back out of province once again. I chose Crown of the Kobold King because I was really interested in the adventure itself, the scenario. It is a hardcover standalone adventure, but it is a revisiting, or sort of not a revisiting, but it's a revision to 3 original game mastery modules that released before the Pathfinder rule set even existed. So I was kind of interested in revisiting the history there. The adventure takes place begins in the town of Falcon's Hollow, which is kind of a location where people go to when they are either desperate, nowhere else to go, or if they're trying to escape their past, for lack of better phrasing. It's not necessarily an evil town, but it is very cold. All right, the average citizen, while they may even be good at heart, have learned that you kind of have to look out for number one. So it's just kind of it's not an outwardly hostile environment, but it is one where the players really shouldn't rely on the kindness of strangers, so to speak. Each of the player characters had their own reason for coming to the town and their own reason for wanting to travel out into the Darkmoon Vale, which is the forest outside of Falcon's Hollow. Falcon's Hollow itself is also a town that relies heavily on its lumber industry, and the town is effectively run by the Lumber Consortium, which is essentially a crime, a mafia family, if you want to look at it that way, with the lumber trade as their legitimate business. So each of the players had their own motivations, and the characters are as follows. We had a goblin alchemist who was actually a custom-made character, but the goblin, his reason for coming to the Vale was years ago there was a hag that was slain by a group of adventurers. The hag in this instance was well known for concocting brews and potions and poisons and all kinds of alchemical items, and the goblin was drawn here hoping that some of her alchemical research would have remained behind. However, the exact location of the hag's hut is vague at best, and if the townsfolk know about it, similar to another location that's crucial to a lot of the characters' motivations, if they know of it, they're really not sharing that information. Not necessarily because they're afraid of it, but they are concerned about, what could happen if would-be adventurers stir things up in those regions and then come back to town and sort of revisit that evil on everybody there. There was also a Dwarven Ranger. He was one of the pre-gen characters. However, his motivation is that he is following in the footsteps of one of his clanmates, who came to this region looking for a location known as Droskar's Crucible, believing that there was a magic relic there that is said to guard the way back from death. And he's not necessarily as interested in the relic itself as he is just discovering the fate of his clansmen. There's also a human sorceress who is another pre-gen character, and she's also looking to get to Droskar's Crucible, though her reason for wanting to go there is completely tied to the legends or rumors of powerful magics that have been long abandoned there. Another one of the player characters is an elven rogue who was a pre-gen, though slightly modified by the player. And this individual is actually from a minor thieves guild in a nearby city who are trying to expand their influence. And as part of that, they know that in order to take on some of the larger, more established guilds, they're going to need allies. So the thief has come to Falcon's Hollow in an attempt to create an alliance between them and the Lumber Consortium. However, so far he's been unable to secure an audience with the leader of the consortium, basically saying that if you want to get any sort of inroads with this individual, you need to prove your value to the organization. And to that effect, he has been told that several of the lumberjacks in the lumber camps that are on the outskirts of the Darkmoon Vale refuse to actually go to work because of reports of an unusually intelligent wolf that has been laying traps for the lumberjacks, and they've been going missing at an alarming rate. So if this thief can help deal with that wolf, then he may be able to secure a meeting with the leader of the consortium in an effort to secure an alliance that will strengthen his guild so that they can become a little bit more aggressive in their expansion. Another one of the characters is a hermit who begins the campaign as a wizard. However, after playing that character and noting that there is another arcane character in the party, he did ask to revamp his character and convert it into a druid instead, so that he can sort of act as a healer and that the druid would fit the theme of his hermit character a little bit better. The hermit was drawn into Falcon's Hollow as one of the hunters from the town that goes into the outskirts of the woods, just kind of dips his toes into the woods a little bit. Would normally sort of visit with the hermit, and they did create a bit of a bond and friendship. The hunter would bring some of the rabbits, for example, that he would catch in his snares that were just too mangy, too scrawny for him to be able to take back to Falcon's Hollow and try to sell in the high market. So he sort of formed a friendship with this hunter, and the hunter did keep a very regular schedule. And much to the hermit's dismay, it's been a couple of weeks since he has seen his friend. And when he came back to town to try to learn of what was going on, or when he came into town to try to learn of what was going on, everybody just assumes that the hunter just up and left the village or left the town to try to make a better life for himself. However, he felt that that was unlikely based off of what he knew of the character. So he is trying to find information that he can about his friend and what may have befallen him. He has learned that other people from town have also gone missing. But again, most people chalk it up to they just simply, leave and try to make a better life for themselves. Though the odds of that, at least into the hermit's mind, are a little bit on the slim side. And then finally, the other character is a Gnoll Barbarian, a fully custom-made character. And the Gnoll is looking to get to Droskar's Crucible because a while back, a rather unnerving human magic user came into his clan's. Well, they don't really have a camp necessarily because they are somewhat nomadic. But he approached the clan and offered to trade gems, to trade items, to have a couple of the gnolls from the tribe escort him to the Crucible as sort of like a type of protection. However, it has been quite some time, and they were expected to have been returned a while ago. So while the chieftain is not necessarily concerned about it, the Gnoll Barbarian, wants to know what happened to his brothers, and so he came to Falcon's Hollow because he did know that that was a destination that the human would have been bringing the gnolls to try to find out more information for him. Now, to begin the adventure, like I said, none of the players really had any experience with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so I really wanted to get them used to the combat system in a way that they would be able to engage with the combat system, but it not be a situation where if they just don't understand it well enough, or if things go poorly, that it would lead to their characters dying. So I decided to have each of the characters be in town for a random number of days. It was a d6 plus 1. And the longer that they were in town, the more attempts they would have at learning information about their personal quests. But they would all sort of come together when they would find out that others were also looking to go out into the woods, and that they were all looking for a safety in numbers type of situation. So over time, the characters would come together to form the adventuring party. However, every night when they would sort of congregate at this tavern, some of the locals would become increasingly more hostile towards them, a bit more insulting towards them. And at the beginning of this session, it was going to sort of reach a boiling point. So all of the characters were in the tavern. They all knew each other at this point. They were all planning on going out into the Vale on the following morning. However, a group of hunters from the town, as well as a well-known drunkard and a ruffian, made their way into the tavern, and the ruffian in particular, began mouthing off to the player characters. Now, I actually had wrote out a scenario of events that would occur in the event that the players just weren't receptive to throwing the first punch or initiating this tavern brawl, which is what I had set up. This way, it was all non-lethal combat. It was all just, to get you used to the 3-action system, to get you used to the way that the combat would sort of flow, type of thing, the initiative system, all those things. And it was in a, like I said, a non-lethal environment where if the players did lose, it wouldn't affect their ability to, go out and actually partake of the adventure. So I'm not going to go through all of the everything that happened, but what I will say, some of the highlights of this fight was the drunkard who had begun making inappropriate comments towards the sorceress. He ended up getting pantsed in the fight and mistook this as a sign that the sorceress was receptive to his advances. You had the gnoll who, on the very opening round of combat, did score a non-lethal, but he did score a critical hit with his bite attack on one of the hunters, who spent most of the fight just dangling unconsciously, limply from the gnoll's mouth, as the gnoll, while he wasn't biting down, refused to let go of his new toy. And the goblin alchemist spending most of the fight just sneaking around and trying to pick people's pockets, rather than actually partake of the fight itself. Eventually, they did defeat the ruffian, who actually did draw his dagger when he started getting close to being knocked out, because, as it turns out, the ruffian was upset that these adventurers had been talking about going into the woods to deal with some of these issues for days, but didn't do anything in a quick enough fashion to prevent his cousin from being one of the people that ended up going missing from one of the lumber camps. So he blames these adventurers for sitting around and doing nothing, while a member of his family is lost, and most likely at this point is now dead. And we never did get quite that far, because the dwarf was way too happy to throw the first fight, even after the slightest bit of provocation. Like, they did their little opening snide remarks, and the dwarf decided that, nope, I've had enough of this, and he immediately just walked over and walloped one of the commoners, kicking everything off. But the guards did arrive eventually. The ruffian was knocked out. Actually, I think the ruffian was killed, because at that point he had attempted a lethal attack against the players, and they were more than justified in striking back at him with lethal force. After that, the characters rested for the night. They recovered from any wounds that they had, so any bruises that they had from the bar brawl, and then they made their way towards one of the lumber camps. So they were kind of going over largely like plains, and at this point. However, while they were on their way to the tavern, or not to the tavern, to the lumber camp from the town, they encountered a trio of kobold zombies. But these zombies are unlike regular zombies in that all three of them had yellow glowing eyes, and the yellow glow kind of left almost like a mist trail behind the kobolds as they moved. These kobolds were meant to be a pretty light challenge. They were unkillable zombies, so they did have that variant where they do resist all damage to a certain extent, but they were vulnerable to critical hits, meaning that they would take additional damage from any hit that was a critical hit against them. Now, with these kobolds having an armor class of 12, and again with critical hits being either a natural 20, which increases the success level by 1, or by equaling or exceeding the target number by 10 or greater, would lead to a critical hit. And this was sort of meant to get that idea over to the players that you can get 10 or better and still it be considered a critical hit. And with all the characters getting +6 or +7 on their attacks and only needing a 5 or a 6 to hit the kobolds, I figured this would be a pretty safe first lethal encounter for them to have to face. But and it also a much easier method of being able to get that critical hit for a 10 or better. So again, to try to introduce that system to the players. And never in my life have I seen so many people struggle to roll above a 4 in my life. For several rounds, everybody was rolling 2s or 3s or 1s or 4s or not enough to secure a hit on the zombies. And in the process, the zombies were able to actually knock the Gnoll Barbarian unconscious and into the dying state, which did allow me to introduce the dying mechanics to the group, as well as the wounded mechanic for when the Gnoll was restored back to consciousness afterwards. So it worked out well for that. I was able to teach that system as well. Since, again, like, I didn't want to info dump a whole bunch of stuff at the beginning of the game and then expect the players to retain any of that. The best way that I find to learn a new system is just by doing it and figuring things out sort of as you go, which was the method that I took for this particular situation. Now, they were able to eventually defeat the kobolds, and they were able to defeat these zombies by hitting them with critical hits and just obliterating them from that point. They did make their way finally to the lumber camp, which was about a day's travel from the town itself, so it was getting close to evening or nightfall when they arrived. The loggers were initially quite inhospitable to the player characters. However, the Gnoll used his diplomacy, and by diplomacy I mean intimidate, to cow everybody into letting the players sleep there overnight. While they were in camp, they did learn of the situation with this intelligent wolf that seems to be setting traps for the loggers. And one of the loggers was willing to take the player characters to the location where one of their members had been abducted from. So he was willing to do that in the morning, not at night. So the players rested. They woke up the next morning, and while they were getting ready to break camp and leave the lumber camp and go into the woods, they also discovered a bizarre trail had been left behind not too far outside of the camp itself. This looked like a rather large snake had slithered through the area, but instead of it just being like a snake slither, it did look like there were claw marks that were regularly, in regular intervals along this trail, as if a snake-like creature with claws had gone through the area. Because we did have characters that were aware of, had like knowledge nature, had the nature skill to recall knowledge or woodland lore, they were able to deduce that this creature was what was known as a Tatzlwyrm. And while this wasn't likely to be what's been abducting the loggers, it is also something that could be a serious threat to the lumber camp. So the players decided to wait and hold off on going to where the logger had been abducted from, and instead track down the Tatzlwyrm. The Ranger and the Barbarian did have quite a few ranks, not ranks, but did have quite a good bonus in the survival skills, so they were able to follow the tracks to a small wooded sort of clearing area with just a few trees kind of dotted throughout it. However, they didn't realize that the Tatzlwyrm was aware that it was being followed at this point and actually set up an ambush and dropped down from one of the larger trees in the middle of this field, or in the middle of this sort of clearing area, and began the fight. So this, again, was a very tough fight with the player characters struggling to defeat this somewhat impressive foe. Because I had more players than the average size, the average party size is 4 for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I had 6 player characters, so I gave the Tatzlwyrm the Elite adjustment, which gave it 15 extra hit points, as well as just a +2 bonus to its armor class, to its attacks and damage and saving throws and things along those lines. The Gnoll was once again knocked into unconsciousness. The Dwarf was also very nearly knocked down as well. Several individuals ended up taking damage in that fight. However, in the end, they were able to defeat the Tatzlwyrm and they were able to claim parts of its body as trophies with the barbarian, or with the dwarf, I believe, the dwarf or the barbarian. One of them wanted to take some teeth and the claws from one of the creature's hands to make a necklace with. Fresh off their victory and sort of like happy with what they've accomplished, they made their way back to the lumber camp, which is where we left off for the very first session. So overall, just the experiences running the first little bit of this campaign, I had a really great time with it. The group was a fantastic group to run for. I had run for most of the players in the group before, but a couple of the people were, were new. And as always, when it comes to new players, I always do feel a lot of anxiety, a lot of nerves leading up to actually starting the session. But once I got going, I became very comfortable with it. And one of the players who was a long-time gaming veteran, somebody who's been gaming for decades now, he did say that he really enjoyed my DMing style and had a great time. So for me, that's one of the biggest compliments that I can get as a DM, when other really experienced players or really experienced dungeon masters or game masters actually say that they enjoyed the way that I ran the game. And it was a ton of fun. I really loved running the bar fight, which was a custom opening scenario. Again, it was meant to teach the combat system, and I think that worked pretty well overall. The players had a great time. With that, the Kobold fight was tougher than it needed to be, but it was still a fun time. The one thing that I will say is the Crown of the Kobold King does start off with a lot of like just singular creatures for the players to go up against. So like the unkillable zombie Kobold was just a one of that the adventure had for the players to fight. But again, I didn't want it to be a complete and total, I didn't want it to be a trivial situation. So with 6 people attacking this one kobold zombie, I felt that would have been a little bit too easy. So I upped the number to 3. So it wasn't quite one for each player character, but it was about half the party size for them to be able to team up and fight these kobolds with. And it was a tough fight, but tougher than I was expecting it to be. But that wasn't because of how powerful the zombies were, or how difficult their damage reduction 3 made them. It was just the fact that nobody could seem to roll above a 4 for like 3 rounds of combat. And when they got to the logging camp, they were able to deal with the people there, as well as deal with the people in Falcon's Hollow, which it is a bit of a hostile town in general, but for the way that the players play their characters, they seem to fit in really well with the locals there. And the fight with the Tatzlwyrm kind of left them on a high note at the end of the session. So it was a great time overall, and I'm looking forward to running more of this. And I decided that I'll be doing these sort of recap videos as sort of a journal, if for no other reason than just because it's a fun video to do. But if some of the players miss a game, then they'll be able to watch the recap video to sort of learn what happened. So anyway, it was a great time, really enjoying it, and really liking the Crown of the Kobold King so far. I do have to make some adjustments because, again, it is a larger than average party size, but that's fine. I've been making adjustments to pre-written adventures for years now. It's nothing that's unusual to me, and I had a really great time with it. So let me know in the comments below if any of you have gone through Crown of the Kobold King, either with Pathfinder 2nd Edition or way back in the day when it was a 3.5 D&D Game Mastery scenario. How were your experiences with that? And, how did your players start off that particular campaign? Do try, please, to avoid any spoilers for future events in the Crown of the Kobold King adventure, because I do know that some of the group definitely watch the videos that I do regularly, so I don't want them to be spoiled on what's happening. But let me know at least your opening experiences with the adventure in the comments. Anyway, thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Until then, take care.